Welcome, everyone. Gosh, that's a strong welcome. Welcome to everyone here in Washington and to our online audience. I'm Sara Pantuliano. I'm the Chief Executive of ODI, and I'm really delighted that we are starting, at least I am starting, this week in Washington with this conversation that is really critical. We are launching today ODI's newest report. It's really focused on micro and small enterprises and digitalization. I think you're all in this room and you're connecting online because you know how important micro and small enterprises are. They're really vital engines of growth, especially in emerging markets. In the last 20 years, there have been various efforts to try and include these businesses, both financially and digitally. But there is still so much work to do, despite all the rhetoric, despite all the efforts, despite I don't know how many conversations we have held about that. And so that's why we embarked on this research. And the great thing about the research is that it was generously supported by Visa. And it was fantastic to be able to collaborate with a private sector partner that is clearly interested in see how we move the dial on these things. The team evaluated 109 national digitalization strategies in 4 different languages. And it found a few references to micro and small enterprises and their needs. Probably not enough, but at least enough to start the conversation. There are clear benefits in understanding the needs of micro and small enterprises, their experiences with digital payments, because there are so many challenges still with the adoption of technology. And so we need to understand where the blockages are and what we can do to unblock that. We carried out, or the team rather carried out, in-depth work in Colombia and South Africa, and they really paint a very vivid pictures of the businesses in question, which we will explore in the course of the conversation today. We'll start with listening to my colleague and author of the report, Carl Long, who will present the key findings, and then we have a fantastic panel to engage in the conversation on some of the things that emerged from the report. But without further ado, Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks again to Visa for funding the work and for giving us the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm going to move through this relatively quickly because, as Sarah mentioned, we have an excellent panel, but hopefully it'll be useful to set up the conversation that follows. Okay, Ben, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're looking at digital payments and the economic empowerment and inclusion of micro and small enterprises. And I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the research questions that we were looking at, what we actually did to investigate those research questions, what we learned in terms of findings, and then what we think this means in terms of recommendations. So these are the research questions that we set out for ourselves. I like to summarize these in terms of what are governments saying they are going to do and what are governments actually doing with or in partnership or not in partnership with the private sector. So moving on, Ben. So the way we went about this is we first conducted a literature review to kind of define the concepts we were talking about. What is a micro enterprise? What is a small enterprise? What's a digital payment? What does economic empowerment and inclusion mean? We also looked at the literature in terms of setting out a conceptual framework for how we think digital payments do lead to the economic empowerment and inclusion of micro and small enterprises. We then looked at, as Sarah mentioned, 109 national digital strategies and did a text analysis to see if the things that were coming up in the literature review were also coming up in those strategies. We also looked at some of the latest data available from the World Bank, in particular 2 sources, the enterprise surveys, which are a long-running survey, but we looked at more recent results from the post-COVID era because we think COVID caused a big jump in digital payments. So we looked more specifically at the post-COVID era. And we also looked at a new bunch of surveys on informal enterprises that the bank launched from around 2019. And finally, we did case studies with key informant interviews in Colombia and South Africa. Okay, and next slide. Thank you. So the findings from the literature review in brief, these concepts we're looking at, they're broad concepts. Digital payments can mean a lot of things. So the definition we used essentially was not cash. And that's kind of consistent with organizations like the Better in Cash Alliance that give a long list of potential things that could be representative of a transition from cash to digital. Economic empowerment and inclusion, again, are very broad concepts. You know, financial inclusion is something that a lot of organizations focus on, but economic empowerment and inclusion are kind of go beyond that. And MSEs themselves, it's quite a broad and heterogeneous grouping. You can be talking about enterprises in the formal sector or in the informal sector, and there seems to be like quite a big urban-rural divide as well in terms of what you might think of falling into that category. But what is relatively clear is that most micro and small enterprises are actually in the ones in lower income countries are informal micro enterprises, and often the owner is actually the only employee of the enterprise. So that definitely colors our findings. Okay, so this is the conceptual framework that we were kind of put together from various strands of literature. I'm not going to go into it in too much depth in the interest of time. But for example, you know, digital payments often prompt people to open a financial account for the first time, which can then lead to more interactions with the financial institution, and then potentially lead to access to finance through the creation of a digital footprint over time. So there's lots of pathways towards kind of economic empowerment and inclusion via digital payments, not necessarily linear and not necessarily the same for the highly heterogeneous group that we're talking about. But there are also risks, particularly for MSEs that might be more marginalized to begin with. And some of them might find themselves locked out of some markets as we transition more from cash to digital in particular. So moving along, Ben, thank you. So the findings from the text analysis of 109 national digital transformation strategies, we didn't find a lot in there that reflected the literature. They don't have an awful lot to say about digital payments and or economic empowerment and inclusion of micro and small enterprises, either separately or jointly. MSEs or micro, small and medium-sized enterprises appear in less than half of the national digital strategies. And that's because national digital strategies are often focused on making government digital. And kind of the digital economy part is often handled by other strategies in different departments. But some of these strategies do provide some coordination for those strategies. Some of the benefits noted in the literature are observable in the strategies that do make mention of digital payments and MSEs. So you see, for example, references to things like the tourism sector in some strategies and how transitioning to digital payments can lead to benefits for the firms operating in those sectors. But there's much less discussion of the risks in the same way as they are in the literature, although some of the things like digital literacy and other interventions do come up, but not necessarily in terms of mitigating the risk. It's more about getting more and more firms involved in the digital economy. Looking at the data, this first looks at the small enterprises in the formal sector. So it's a specific section of the World Bank enterprise surveys. And unsurprisingly, you know, the number of firms that use digital payments is much higher in higher income countries compared to lower income countries. But we do see a lot of variation as you go down the income scale, and there's outliers like Rwanda, Cambodia, Peru, where usage is actually quite high. We don't offer any answers as to why that is the case, but I'm sure it's something for further research, and I'm sure there's some existing research on this as well. Part of the explanation, though, does seem to be related to the transaction costs. There does seem to be a relationship between higher transaction costs and less use of digital payments. Moving on to the informal enterprises. So there's kind of encouraging results in terms of mobile money specifically is used by quite a number of informal enterprises in lower income countries. The numbers are kind of above 60% in terms of these firms that make payments to suppliers or receive payments from customers via mobile money. But in terms of pathways to economic empowerment and inclusion, it's less clear because a lot of these firms are not actually using a separate bank account. This is a personal bank account that they're using. So that doesn't necessarily lead to access to finance. And a lot of them also state that they don't have a need for a loan. So this kind of finding in the literature is not necessarily consistent with what we're finding in the data for some firms. And the final piece that we took from the data analysis, if you want to go to the next slide, Ben, thanks. This is looking at perceptions of small enterprises, firstly, in the formal sector, in terms of what they see as a constraint. So the perception that access to finance is a constraint is less strong or less high in lower income countries. So again, this pathway towards greater economic empowerment and inclusion through digital payments is not quite as clear as we might have thought in terms of our theoretical framework that we set out at the start. And then similarly, while informal enterprises do say that they might join the formal economy in order to access finance, similar numbers also say that they don't want to join the informal economy because they would have to then start paying taxes or other fees that are associated with formalization. Okay, so that's the data. And then in terms of the case studies, so what we found was that the perceptions of the benefits and risks of digital payments for micro and small enterprises was relatively similar to what we found in the literature. Whether that's because our key informants are being influenced by that literature or vice versa, I'm not quite sure. But some things were emphasized a little bit more than others, particularly the security benefits of not holding cash. So digital payments seems to act like almost as a form of insurance. But then there was challenges on both the demand and supply side. The kind of obvious ones on the supply side are electricity and internet, and their intermittency. You know, South Africa was one of the case studies that we looked at. They've had electricity problems going on for over a decade now. And then on the demand side, there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, about weighing up the costs and benefits. Yes, a lot of micro and small enterprises do want to use digital payments, but they're not sure it's worth it. Like, do their customers want to be able to pay using digital payments? how much are the costs, both in terms of the upfront costs and the ongoing costs. So it's a bit difficult for them to weigh up the cost and benefits is the takeaway that we kind of got from this. And then the challenges around formalization and taxation that also appeared in the data analysis were also things that were coming up regularly in terms of key informant interviews. And then there's this kind of nexus of trust, digital literacy, fraud, cybersecurity fraud, but also just more common kind of fraudulent actions that key informant interviews raised. What we did find as well across both case studies was that there was kind of universal calls on the need for more collaboration across government with the private sector, and in particular with MSEs' own associations. And there is evidence of this coordination in action, despite not being in digital strategies. What we did find is, you know, countries have strategies for digital payments related to MSEs. They're just not necessarily in the national digital transformation strategy. So in terms of recommendations, I think this first recommendation kind of recognizes that governments are kind of fiscally constrained at the moment. They can't do everything in the same way as the firms are trying to weigh up the costs and benefits of of whether to take on digital payments. Governments need to be thinking about, like, what are the interventions that are going to be most effective now, and how to sequence them in terms of firms that do want to make this transition, whereas compared to other firms that might need more time and different interventions. We kind of saw a need to strengthen the digital ecosystem, digital payment ecosystem more generally, in partnership with the private sector and civil society, in terms of improving digital literacy, also the supply side issues like internet and electricity. So it's not really, I mean, I think people say this a lot, it's not just about the technology. There's lots of other kind of supporting investments that need to be made as well in terms of this transition. And the final slide, we got the impression from MSE key informant interviews in particular, as well as ones with the private sector, that, you know, consultation, like in the form of user research, was important, particularly based on this finding that, unsurprisingly, MSEs are extremely heterogeneous. So the needs of one group are not necessarily the same as others. And governments in the private sector are probably going to have to invest a lot in understanding the needs of different users as they try to bring them into the kind of digital economy. And there's probably opportunities for them to collaborate in doing that as well. Across the board, I think we saw that investing in coordinating institutions and capabilities was important. Kind of digital leaders were seen as very important in both countries. I think we're lucky enough to have one of them with us on the panel today. And the final point, which coming from a public finance team at ODI, I took away as being very relevant, was the need to communicate policies around the relationship between digital payments, formalization, and taxation. The idea that held in government or and circles that the taxation or domestic resource mobilization is the main use case for digital payments. I'm not sure that's going to be borne out for many of the micro enterprises that are operating today. And I think clearer communication as to what the expectations are in terms of when can you use digital payments and what does it trigger in terms of formalization and taxation at different points going forward will be important for governments to communicate if they want to transition more firms to using digital payments. So that's it. And you can access the full report at the QR code there. Thank you. So.
Thank you so much, Carl. I think we're going to remove the projector so we can all fit here. There was a lot of really interesting learning there. You're also very welcome to take the hard copies of the report for those who are in the room, of course, not just scan it. But I think we're going to start from some of the key if you want, this universal call for collaboration. That's why we decided to convene a conversation, in addition to the report, that brought together representatives from government, from the private sector, from civil society, to really think how we can, hit some of these recommendations to improve policy design and delivery, to, coordinate the different institutions. I'm really delighted to have a fabulous panel with us to discuss the findings of the report. I'll introduce them one by one, and you can take your nameplate and sit next to me. I'll start with Ana Maria Prieto. Ana Maria is the head of payment systems at the Central Bank of Colombia. Welcome. Adel Mir is the manager at the International Finance Corporation. Welcome, Adel. Feel free to sit where you prefer. Christopher Jones Baptista is the executive director at Data2X. And last but not least, Chagozie Nyabuebo is the vice president for growth at Visa. So I'll start with a conversation with the panelists with a few questions, but then we'll come to the audience, both here in the room and online. So also online, feel free to put questions that my colleagues will send over to me later. Ana Maria, I'll start with you. Carl shared some of the findings and referred to some of the work that we did in Colombia as a case study. And our researchers interviewed you as well, along with many others for the publication. So thank you for your insights. But can you tell us a little bit more about micro and small businesses in your country, and also what kind of efforts is the central bank promoting to try and help these very small enterprises? Sometimes it's just one person, really, to really make sure that they can achieve, the full potential.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. It's lovely to be here in this beautiful house. So yes, I think that pretty much of what you have just presented is kind of the situation that we have in Colombia, an emerging country, around 2 million small businesses in general, most of them informal, most of them lack of access to finance and to digital payments. That's kind of the situation that we have in the country. And that's pretty much the context in which the Central Bank of Colombia decided 2 years ago to jump in to make sure that we can help private players to really have a payment system that can work for everyone, that can be open, not just for the small businesses or final user at the end, but also to these new fintech and technology providers that we have around the region. A very interesting sort of innovation going on around this type of new players. I will not say that are bank-led model, but precisely non-bank model that it's running through the whole payment industry. And so what we decided to make is follow much of what the experiences abroad and in the region, like in Brazil, Mexico, and other countries, is just to have a new regulatory framework that can embrace interoperability in the digital payment system. We do have since the pandemic, a lot of, specific payment models, but all of them are not really interconnected between them. So we have closed loop systems, very successful ones, but at the end, not connected and not bringing the entire benefits of digital payment for the end user. So we decided to build this regulatory framework to define those specific rules, specific conditions, and principles that can really give us an interoperable payment system in the country. And then we also had to build a specific infrastructure, like the digital public infrastructure, that can ensure that we have this interoperable payment system going on. So the central bank is having these two, let's say, roles. We are in the middle of the project, building the entire system. We're looking forward to have the new system running on next year. But what maybe in this specific conversation I would like to highlight, and that's, I think, kind of the major effort that the central bank is undergoing right now, is to make sure that we do this under a public-private collaboration or approach. We recognize that the central bank is not very good at innovation, no? So, and this is not really like our role, let's say, but rather to make sure that we have a very level playing field for everyone, and that on top of that, like first layer of the payment system, then we can have those private players coming on and bringing all the innovation and the services that these specifically small businesses and end users do need. So that private-public collaboration, I think it's one thing. The second thing is that we are making sure that the system is quite open for everyone, quite open for this new type of players. We're having a lot of consciousness in when defining these specific rules to make sure that it's not going to be only for incumbent players, but rather it's going to be very open. Just to give you one example, a couple of years ago, we only had 2 acquiring companies in the country. And those are the ones that at the end bring the services to the small businesses. We now have around 10. And there's a new type of business case that we hope that come with less costs for those businesses or merchants at the end. Give you an idea, we have MDR around 3%, 5%, something like that. That is really very costly for a merchant to accept digital payments. But with this new type of business cases around the acquiring, we are seeing something around less than 1% or something like that. So even approaching the 0%, because they are beginning to see how they can have a different type model, more based on data and other type of services and so on. So yes, I'll stop there, but this is a very interesting report. Definitely, we do have a lot of challenges looking ahead to scale the system to make sure that we can bring other type of use cases and definitely consolidate this effort so it can be a different thing for businesses in the country.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. Really interesting. And in a way, it hits some of the recommendations of the report where you're trying to do work in the private sector, trying to design responses that build on the competence of the various actors, but actually trying to meet the end users, where they really see the priority. And on that, actually, Adele, I want to go to you because, this public-private collaboration needs to include also some of the bigger institutions, multilateral development banks as well. I mean, we know that micro and small enterprises make up the majority of businesses globally. And you at the IFC have the mandate to strengthen the private sector, particularly in emerging markets. So can you tell us how a development institution, finance institution like the IFC is trying to empower these small and very small firms, and perhaps tell us interventions that you feel have really had an impact?
So thank you very much, and thank you for the report. Very happy to be here. I found it very compelling because a lot of what's mentioned in the report has been talked about, but it's good to document it and make it realistic by grounding it into, real examples applied in 2 jurisdictions. For us, I mean, if you take a step back, when we always talk about this MSME finance gap, and it's estimated at 5.7 trillion, and you break it down, and you have some data which tells you about the informal sector, then where possible, the gender disaggregated data, the gap is huge, right? And we talk about it and we all say that it exists, but I think the use of data and applying this data lens puts more number and numerical evidence on the table, right? It's not just hidden away, they're transacting behind the scenes using cash. Now you actually have hard transactional data, which then tells you that this market exists and financial services are needed to support it. I agree with Ana Maria. It's not necessarily the role of the central bank to get into the lending aspect. They're more about maintaining financial stability. But there are 2 equations, right? You've got to get access to finance. So you've got to have solutions that provide those liquidity products to the people that need it at a competitive and affordable rate. But they need other financial services as well. And they need savings products. They need some sort of risk mitigation products. And that's where the formal financial sector and those new database lenders have to come together and provide that suite of financial products to these micro and small and medium enterprises. From IFC's perspective, our portfolio today is around 19 billion in terms of what we do in supporting MSMEs across emerging markets, majority of which, 87%, is our work through financial institutions, which is part of what I do. Our strategy is kind of broken down into 3 main pillars, right? There's integration. So we got to get small business owners and particularly underserved segments, so women, youth, to get more integrated into that formal economy, to be more aware of where those opportunities are, and to have an equal opportunity to come and compete and offer their products as the bigger guys do. There's innovation. As we all know, for MSMEs, it's always important that they remain at the forefront of innovation. They've got to continue to compete. They've got to continue to show that they're adding value, and they've got to continue to grow their market space. And finally, it's inclusion. And inclusion for us is beyond just access to financial services. It's efficient usage of financial services. And beyond that, there has to be a net utility gained, right? So there has to be an improved livelihoods that results from increased access and increased usage of financial services. And that brings me to the realm where we are very active, is making sure that not only are we supporting the provision of financial services, but we're also building the safeguards. Financial consumer protection is very important. You can't just open the guardrails and let everybody offer all sorts of financial services without the right safeguards in place, which then leads to over-indebtedness, misinformation, and really a breakdown of trust. And that's what it really comes down to. You know, I still remember it's 2 decades ago where my grandmother insisted on using a travel agent to book her tickets because she just did not trust Expedia. And and no matter how many times you told her it was the same ticket on the same airplane and it costs a fraction of the price, she insisted on sitting in front of somebody who did the search for her and bought the ticket. But it's a question of trust. You know, once you build that trust in that ecosystem, people will come and use it. But they've got to use it so that they see benefits from it. And that's really what we're trying to do, is really develop that whole ecosystem.
Yeah. Absolutely, key points. And you raise inclusion. I really want to touch on that and bring in Krista, because I think you're probably the best qualified to focus on that side of the conversations. I mean, the report talks about how heterogeneous the micro and small enterprises are, the different needs that they have, whether they're in urban or rural areas, they're formal or informal. And you've spent many years working on financial inclusion, particularly focusing on women. So there is an aspect of the report that touches on both financial inclusion and digital inclusion. Can you share with the audience what you think the link is, and how the diversity of these micro and small enterprises impacts on inclusion efforts?
Yes, thank you so much. All right. Yes. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you and congratulations on the launch of this informative and important report. I have spent my career working on digital and data inclusion and really thinking about it holistically. And now at Data 2X, we focus on, we're a civil society organization and focused on gender data uptake and use for policies that are increasing equality, equity, and leading to a more just and sustainable world. And so when it comes to digital payments and digital financial services, one thing that came up in the presentation for us to remember is that, particularly for these small women-led businesses, we're competing with cash, right? And so we have to think about trust. We have to think about inclusion. And really the goal is this responsible, accessible digital financial services for MSEs. Particularly, we think about women-led businesses. And so financial inclusion and digital inclusion are very much linked in a number of ways. And first of all, the rise of digital financial services in all its forms means that financial inclusion really depends on digital inclusion. And we know that there's still a number of individuals that are not connected to the internet. So that's something to think about first and foremost. And second, we know that to really as we heard from the IFC, that the benefits of digital payments and being included in this space cut across multiple sectors. So they go beyond just economic growth, but really thinking about education, health, climate change response. Those aspects are really critical across their individuals' livelihoods. And so we have to think about the ways that we can increase meaningful access and that we can connect and continue to connect digital access and financial services. And we know that, as the report highlights, rural and underserved populations, including women SME owners, they may be later adopters of digital payments. And so how do we be more inclusive from the outset and think about that at the beginning of the digital transformation journey, the beginning of the policy conversations? We know also that the role of government is so critical here, and the role of private sector and civil society. And so really thinking about how do we engage in policy dialogues that address payments, I think also build out and sort of meet women business owners in particular where they are in their journey. I've seen throughout my career really effective campaigns to increase digital literacy, trust, and cybersecurity literacy, even though you think cybersecurity might be a later part of the digital transformation journey. If you can embed that up front, then you can really address some of the concerns. Some research that I did in my previous role, leading DAI Center for Digital Acceleration, we found that some of the biggest barriers are around cyber or other types of, phishing, those sorts of attacks that can happen very early in the engagement journey with particularly women-led businesses. And it really diminishes their willingness to participate and then the benefits that they can receive. So really important to keep that in mind. And then kind of the flip side of that is that there's a real opportunity because of there's both opportunities and challenges, but there's opportunities to really innovate and to really think about how to design products that can meet the needs of these heterogeneous groups, and that can cultivate innovation and entrepreneurship in their own way within markets, and create kind of virtuous cycles working with, again, this partnership, fintechs and others. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And obviously, we've heard from you, as from everyone else on the panel, and from the end users, how important it is that all of this is discussed and designed with the private sector. I mean, Chagoze couldn't be more open about, the importance of you as private sector being involved in the conversation. Of course, Visa is a well-known, player in the digital payment space. So what can and does Visa do? What role can it play in partnering with governments, with other stakeholders to try and enhance the benefits of digital payments for micro and small enterprises?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel and representing Visa, and also to really highlight the wonderful report that was done. For context, the role that I have at Visa is really in advancing inclusive growth. So in support of micro enterprises all over the world, underserved communities, to really advance their financial inclusion and advance their growth. And so this is a really critical question that you ask in sort of what does Visa do in sort of partnering with key stakeholders. And we tend to follow what has been highlighted by all of our panelists here, this sort of collective impact approach, which means partnership is critical. If you think of the entire sort of journey, and if we put the micro enterprise owner at the center, there is a need for them to have access to the sort of digital ecosystem, as you've mentioned. From access, there's a need to give them all the right tools, education, support to be able to actually then participate and use those digital payments effectively. And then there are a lot of other scaffoldings that are needed and necessary. Policy has been mentioned, innovation, the right solutions that meet them where they are. All of these things require partnership. All of these things require different entities to play different roles. And in that context, Visa partners across the board to truly sort of design solutions, and then as a payments player, develop safe and secure rails that allow for micro enterprises to successfully participate. So I think that partnership is extremely critical in this context, and it is something that Visa continuously does with governments, with public sector players, social sector players, community engagement. I really appreciated your example with the loyalty to travel. My mother also used to be very similar. And so, but in certain instances like that, engaging the community and actually having others who may have tried Expedia and can actually convey as a trusted source that, hey, actually, it does work. That is also something that we tend to also participate in, just community engagement and sort of driving more adoption and closer connection to the end user.
Let's stay on this trust point because it's so important. And, we've all read experiences of our mothers and grandmothers. We've heard through the research how many business, especially micro businesses, women entrepreneurs, how apprehensive they are about the technology. In the research, they've expressed concerns about the possibility of fraud when transitioning to a digital system, about cybersecurity. You mentioned community engagement. Can you give us some tangible examples of what Visa is doing to address these concerns?
Yes, absolutely. Recently, Visa actually entered into a collaboration with GSMA, the Mobile World Congress, to advance financial inclusion over the next few years for 20 million individuals and businesses. Micro enterprises is a key focus, women-led businesses as a very key focus. And one of the key aspects to looking to advance financial inclusion, especially in the mobile ecosystem, one of that has to do first with just digital literacy, as was mentioned. Access is another key piece. And then after having access, safe and secure environments and ecosystems for collaboration. Unfortunately, for example, we see that more women are susceptible to fraud within the sort of the mobile ecosystem in particular. And so there are opportunities here for us to actually collaborate, take a user-centered design approach and figure out what are those pain points and how do we design solutions that facilitate safer and secure sort of payment spaces. Financial education literacy is a really critical component here as well. And a number of the things that Visa does is also deliver relevant and tailored financial education to meet people where they are so that they could better understand what it means to utilize digital payments, where there are susceptibilities or opportunities to avoid fraud, how to be more responsible, and also be better protected in this context. So those are some of the places where those concerns are extremely valid, but it is important to sort of rally around and figure out those pain points and solve for them.
Absolutely. And I think getting better data to understand what the concerns are and, what the issues at stake are is really critical. And Krista, this comes to you because, we saw in the research that the data were there, but also not a lot of data on the micro enterprises, on the small enterprises. It was really hard to find them. And that influences the ability to develop better policies, more tailored policy. What can we do to get better data?
Great, thank you. And, at Data 2X, we really believe in the power of responsible data to catalyze positive change. And so I really appreciate this question. We recently released a report called the Women's Financial Inclusion Data Playbook. And this really focuses on the ways that, and kind of provides a roadmap for collecting and using data. We conducted research in 6 countries to look at real use cases of how financial institutions, governments, and others were collecting and using data. And one of our main findings was that there were persistent data gaps, particularly on the supply side, that really limited our ability on the policy and product side So that's definitely a place to start and to think about. And we also found that where data did exist, where there was sex disaggregated financial data, it was siloed and wasn't really being used throughout the life cycle of a product or policy development process. In part, this comes from some challenges in terms of identifying and tagging businesses, understanding who the owners are of those businesses. And this gets back to some of the formality pieces that you talk about in the report. And they also exist because of a lack of common definition. So understanding what we mean at the global, national, and regional level about, size of businesses and those definitions. And so part of our work with the WIFID partnership was around standards and understanding and coming to some common understanding around those. I also think that, again, this comes back to digitization and financial literacy. If we can connect those more and leverage some digital tools to collect data, perhaps over time, that can be really critical. And so what we found in terms of the your kind of practical question, right, is the first is really diagnosis and understanding what's going on, where there's data gaps, where we could collect data, where some low-hanging fruit might exist to collect that data, or key partnerships and collaboration, and working with community. We've started exploring new data models around data sovereignty and agency, where we can tap into existing community organizers and community groups and work with them directly. And then raising awareness, because I think there's a perception that financial institutions and governments have a lot of data. Sometimes it's good to just expose and kind of highlight those gaps, and then look at kind of holistic data systems where interoperability is addressed and those pieces, and then building capability. So understanding where really the needs are around across, the data ecosystem when it comes to MSMEs. And then using that data. So that's the other key piece. And I know we're talking about that in a number of examples, but really, how do you not just collect and have the data, but then use it effectively? I think we're still learning, all of us, about that, which is why these use cases and reports, I think, are so critical.
Thanks, Lisa. I know you need to leave us a little bit earlier, but it's okay. When you need to go, you can. Oh, you're good? Okay, even better. Because the questions are starting to come from the online audience, I see. But I just want to put two last questions to Anna Maria and Adele, because even in what Krista was saying, we go back to the importance of this collaboration, across the public-private sector and obviously with academia, civil society. And, you are a policymaker. Can you share some, what you think has been working in terms of coordination from the experience of Colombia across this, sort of range of stakeholders?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, we have been using this approach of really working closely with the private sector to really understand what's the problem and what's like the frictions that we are having in the industry, and then try to master together with them what would be the exact solutions to bring into the table. But maybe to highlight one specific example of that, I think successful collaboration is related with the user experience precisely. So obviously in digital payments, when we are speaking of making sure that we can have a lot of acceptance in digital payment, we need to assure that that user experience is very simplified and I would say standardized in some way. What we did, we had this a lot of roundtable discussions together with the industry, because at the end is their experience in taking the service to the last mile, in making sure that we catch what successful lessons and not very successful lessons of what would be that user experience. And we, at the end, make sure that we defined in the regulation what would be those requirements. And I think we managed to have a very good example of what type of topics in the collaboration is useful. And then the other thing has to do with financial education or payments education in this specific project, making sure that we can take all of this, dissemination, I would say promotion of the digital payment of the new service together with the industry. Again, it's going to be through those channels and through their private efforts that we are going to reach those end users. So the voice of the private players telling us what is going to work and what should not work, it's a very relevant thing. We tackling these things, we needed to make sure that the table was open for everyone. This is a very diverse industry. It is not just about financial institutions or incumbent players, but rather there's a lot of voices around the industry. So we as the central bankers make sure that again, the table was open for everyone and that we were really listening to everyone. I think that's something that we need to take into account, the very diverse situation that we now have with all of these fintechs. And that's sometimes it's not very easy to do. We as policymakers sometimes are not very, used to talk with a lot of people, no? And sometimes we are not trusting everyone or no? So I think that also requires a little bit of new capabilities and a little bit of public innovation, I will say, in the way that we deliver the services and the way that we design also the policies. That's something that we need to learn again.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I was saying before we had colleagues from a well-known stablecoin at ODI last week. We were all learning about the diversity in the environment and, how we need to really leverage what everybody brings to the table to accelerate financial inclusion. But Adele, from your perspective, sitting in an international institution, who is best positioned to do what? How do you see the different players come together?
So I agree. I think it has to be public-private partnership. But I think one of the biggest elements that I see this data transformation really helping is in the timeliness of a response. You talk about the blip around COVID. I think those are going to be much more frequent and probably even more severe, and that's going to be driven by climate change. It's going to be driven by exogenous shocks. And the ability to use a digital payment system allows both private and public stakeholders to come in and provide that safeguards or assistance in a much more timely and much more directed manner. It all comes down to making sure that there is some sort of uniform digital ID. So coming back to what's needed, right? So it has to start with the right sort of principles. You've got to have an identification methodology that is reliable, that is updatable, that is verifiable, and that has trust on both sides. Trust on the side of the person that's issuing the ID, then the trust on the part of the person that's using the ID and accepting the ID on a transactional basis. And then you build services on top of that. I think key to not just financial services, but healthcare, insurance, all the things that Ana Maria said is outside of the banking sector, but important services that need payments made on a regular basis that fall outside of that regulated financial sector. But unless they're integrated into the system, the beneficiary is not going to be able to really utilize that network as efficiently as they need. I mean, case in point, when the hurricane happened in Acapulco, the last one, not the most recent one, it just took 8 months for the national government surveying agency to validate that the losses were made, right? And that's just for an SME, that's a lifetime. They can't survive 8 months. And all it took was their inability to have enough surveyors physically attest to the fact that the boat was missing or the restaurant was damaged or the shop was destroyed. And if they were able to claim their insurance losses through the national agency, through a data file, it could be settled even partially so much faster. So I think what we've got to do is build that ecosystem of financial service providers that buy in to database lending transactional settlements rather than have this. You can still have that physical validation maybe down the road, but for small business owners, it's that timeliness and responsiveness that really matters because these shocks are going to happen. They're going to happen more frequently, and they're going to affect more and more people. And we're working with Luis and team on this natural disaster facility because we think one of the things is that Visa has, at least in certain markets, the network. Right now, we just got to use that network more efficiently to get these products and services sort of thrown in it, rather than just looking at it as a consumer transactional mechanism.
Brilliant. Well, we got just over 50 minutes, 15, 20 minutes to open the conversation to the audience. If you want to take the floor in the room, please say who you are. If you're affiliated to any institution, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. Otherwise, I'll start with the online audience. I was going to give a priority to those who made the effort to come here, if there is any question. Please, do we have a roving mic? Yes, please.
First, thanks so much to everyone for the really interesting insights and to ODI for the great report. I'm Carrie Klutz. I'm with the Open Contracting Partnership, and we focus on public contracts, and public procurement is a massive marketplace. It's $13 trillion annually. And I haven't heard that come up in any of the remarks. One of the main use cases that we've been working on is how this giant procurement market in all countries around the world can be used as a lever for economic empowerment, especially for small businesses and especially for women and other minority-led businesses. And so a lot of what's come up here has resonated. So curious if that came up. I think a lot of the challenges, access to finance, prompt payments, capacity, and just having staff, all of that really resonates. So curious if anyone is thinking about that. And I would love to continue the conversation afterward.
Yes, and you can all stay and have more coffee and pastries. I'll take a few questions and I'll come back to you. And Carl, some questions I think you can address as well. Back at the back.
Thank you. Laura Kelly from the International Institute for Environment and Development. So we're a similar organisation to ODI based in the UK. We do a lot of work with small scale producers, very many in the informal sector. And this issue of concern about formalisation is widespread. And we're seeing it quite interesting now in really critical sectors like critical minerals, so small scale cobalt miners in the DRC. I'd just like to ask a question to all of the panelists, how they see the private sector can play a constructive role in this discussion around formalisation. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Anyone else in the room? Not yet. So let me go to online. Anna Maria, there is a question for you asking how digital payment service providers in Colombia follow responsible practices for micro and small enterprises. And then another question, I guess, for everyone is the benefits of supporting small and micro enterprises also extend to larger corporate supply chain entities. But small and micro enterprises often face being overshadowed. With this in mind, how do we ensure small and micro enterprises' participation in the formal market? How do we ensure that it creates fairer benefits? And this question is from Rose, a student in the UK. Shall we start with this? So there was one direct to you about the experience of Colombia, and then we can go to the rest of the panel for the other questions.
Yeah, so I believe that at the end, we are trying to build trust in the digital payment industry and services. And from that perspective, what we are trying to, with a lot of conscience, try to do is building this regulatory framework, bringing what kind of principles, specific rules, and specific guidelines should all of these private players follow to make sure that we can really tackle the trust mantra that we should have on this industry. I think that's a lot of, you have to disclosure what are really the costs behind, if any, for the end user. Well, that's one thing. And the second thing, again, comes back to the user experience. We should have a very, simplified way to make and originate and receive the payments. But perhaps what at the end, I think it's going to make the difference in this type of new schemes is the scalability of them. Making sure, as you were saying, that we can not just embrace what, mostly the simplified way to make transfers between people or to a merchant, but rather, have a lot of use cases around this ecosystem, make sure that it can scale. It's something that we have been working, again, together with the private players, and making sure that all of those new functionalities and overlay services on top of this ecosystem are being embraced in a very responsible way, and that the private players can really deliver those type of services following those principles.
Thanks. And if you want to address any of the other questions, or if you have any comments on any of the other questions, but otherwise, Adele, there were questions around the procurement market system. There are sort of wider questions on formalization. Anna-Maria.
Yeah, perhaps on the formalization, because I think that's a very difficult one. In the sense that it is a conversation in which a lot of collaboration among different type of government agencies and as well as the private market should be tackling in. What we have been discovering in this whole project is that maybe this is the first layer, to have more data, to really understand what are these struggles that are having these small merchants in every type of segment, the size, and even the country or what specific productive sector they are serving, etc. It's going to be like a first step to better understand the formalization issue. And then on top of that, hopefully, we are going to have a very comprehensive diagnosis to assess the problem of formalization. I will have to say that we are not, I'll say, ready to bring a solution in the formalization. And we're a little bit worried that people are going to believe that the digital payment initiative is something that is just going to, like bring more taxes on top of them, as long as there is more data. And it's precisely the contrary effect that we want to have. But we need to be a little bit careful with the way that we bring the message to the end user again.
It goes back to that trust issue. Yes, of course, then I'll come to you.
I was just going to add on to that per the formalization question. I do think that being able to have very sort of relevant examples or use cases that can be sort of demonstrated to these end users is important on what are those benefits of formalization, whether it's in the advent of other like-minded or similar individuals or businesses who may have gone through a climate-related event and experienced loss. And so now here might be some of those benefits that you might want to plan for and be much more sort of proactive about. So I think one of the ways to help here is providing and having very relevant case studies or examples that showcase the benefits of formalization, and also even showcase any of the areas of concern and just help shine a light on it.
Absolutely. I think, Adele, you were coming next.
So everyone's going to talk about the formalization question, but procurement is important, and happy to have an offline discussion on how we can get that conversation going. I really believe you've got to leave it up to that MSME and individual business owner to decide his or her comfort level on sharing their data and getting more involved in a robust ecosystem. I don't think we need to push everyone down the pike and say, you got to do it, and it's mandated, and it's an obligation. I think if the benefits outweigh the costs, you'll have much more inward interest. If the costs and the threats and the hassle outweigh the benefits, people are going to opt out. It's about coming together and showing the value that's created and letting people judge for themselves what is that application that's most relevant for them and most helpful for their business and their own personal well-being. And that's sort of the direction we'd like to push. I think, as Anna-Maria said, this landscape is changing. It's changing every day. The new entrants, their new products, their new services, their new people coming in and testing things out. It has to be robust, it has to be open, and it has to be tested to see what works and what doesn't.
Thank you, Chris. Great, just to add on to the really amazing comments so far on these questions. One, I think it's good to acknowledge that this issue of formalization is change. It's a big change. It's hard. And I think it's going to take really working in specific geographies, in specific communities over time to get where we want to go or where we think we want to go. And I really appreciate the comment about this, people need to have agency over this process and be able to opt in when it makes sense for them. and they need some help and guidance and understanding to increase their own knowledge and learn about the pros and cons. I'll also make a plug that I think we often talk about public-private sector. I think there's a really important role for civil society to play in moving this agenda forward and moving moving things forward, and in sort of the data collection and the data ecosystem. And then lastly, I think really diverse leadership across all the actors is important, and that includes men and women. That includes, all the intersectional aspects of that, because I think that will have an impact on how quickly we can change if we're able to include more of those voices.
Thank you so much, Krista. We got another 5 minutes to try and grab another couple of questions. One is coming in the audience from the online audience. I can see Ben typing, but yes, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pallavi Rai, and I'm working for the International Organization for Migration. I've been working on financial payments, cash transfers, and humanitarian settings in a number of regions in the world, both in the Middle East and in East Africa. I just wanted to share a couple of observations and ask the panel what their take on this is. So one of the things is that when it comes to provide, and we're looking at financial inclusion to those who are not citizens often, or those who are displaced, because our populations that we serve are often internally displaced people due to a climate shock or a conflict or whatever the case may be for the natural or the natural disaster. So what we have noticed is that, and at least the success cases, and I can talk about that after this meeting's over, is that a bit of a flexibility around the KYC requirements of the central bank have been a big catalyst in kind of pushing towards financial inclusion of some of the populations that we serve. And the second one is that what we've seen often is that in order to establish creditworthiness of some of these populations, guarantees or collaterals have been something which have been quite useful again, and in catalyzing, providing credits and access to finance, especially to women. Now, we on our side of the UN are collecting data and information. We have a displacement tracking matrix where we collect the information. And of course, a lot has to do with data sharing and data inclusion, and we all know the risks and benefits around that. But what we're doing as a standard practice is when we provide cash payments, it's always and collect data for verification. We have a form for informed consent, and it's only on the basis when they sign that, only then will we take that data on. So that's just something I wanted to mention because Adele was talking about it. But I wanted to hear from the panel what your views are around these two topics, especially in the areas of the world where you've been working. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me take one last one from online. You can come at the end. You have a question? I'll come back to you. Absolutely. Let me take one last question from online, then we'll do one last round, including with you, Carl. So it's 2 questions from Kindra Halverson from TechnoServe. What key evidence could we point to for micro and small enterprises leaders that help them understand the benefits of digital payments, either in terms of their growth or other benefits? And are there particular segments of micro and small and medium enterprises that you think stand to benefit more than others? So what I'll do, I'll start with Crystal, come to all the panel, and to you, Kahal, for any final reflections on any of the questions, anything else you want to raise.
Okay, great, thank you. In terms of the evidence to look at around the benefits for digital payments, I think there's been a lot of work and research on this. I know the Better Than Cash Alliance came up, but I think, looking at security, speed of transaction, and the ability to then lean into and be able to use other financial products like savings, insurance, and those pieces are some of the key benefits. And I'm sure that there's others that other panelists have been tracking more closely. So I think that's one piece. But I guess my other plug would be, again, just having a dialogue and a conversation in communities, because there's probably benefits and challenges that we aren't aware of sitting here that really need to be understood by talking to those community groups, and then developing kind of advocacy and materials that are specific to that market. So I think that's a key piece as well. I'll stop there, other than to say, I think the idea of being flexible and kind of working across the ecosystem for the different segments of the population, whether that's migrants or women-owned businesses or more rural businesses, I think is a theme that has sort of been highlighted here today. And there's a role, I think, for the global financial institutions and others to play there, because the incentives for businesses aren't always aligned. And so just kind of acknowledging that and then working together in collaboration.
Yeah, to the question around what evidence exists, I think that there's quite a bit of empirical research and evidence that shows how digital payments have helped to really catalyze growth for a number of businesses. So there is that to be able to sort of showcase, and it is also sort of delineated based on sector and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Perhaps on the cash transfer, that is a heavy one. It's heavy because a difficult one. We have a lot of vulnerability in that specific segments of the population. In Colombia, we have around 2 million or something of migrants from Venezuela. And there has been a lot of efforts going around around this population to make sure that they have a very inclusive way of living in the country while they are still in our country. In the last years, we have been working a lot specifically on the cash transfer. And it's very difficult because despite the efforts of having a simplified KYC, it's difficult to plug in the specific temporary permission that they are receiving while transiting to the national ID. It's difficult because there's a lot of, I'll say, operational costs in making sure that financial institutions can read and understand that specific permission. And it's difficult because they don't have the incentives, like the business case around this very specific segment of the population. They don't have it. They simply don't have it. So of all of the financial institutions that we have in the country, just like 4 of them are really delivering services for this very specific segment of the population. And I'm not talking about credit. I'm just talking about, a simplified account to just make sure that they can have or receive the benefits. So that's when I think that the public-private collaboration becomes more like a triangle in the sense that this multilateral and organizations with their aids, with their benefits, can unlock perhaps the difficulties that we are having, since we don't have a business case yet for this population, at least making sure that we can disperse the cash transfers in a feasible way and helping these financial institutions to find a sort of sustainability business case around this population is a way to tackle the problem. I think we are still struggling to understand the needs of this population and trying to understand what kind of simplified KYC approach we should have, because it's different from the Colombian population. It's a different problem. It's completely different. We still need, I think, to understand it better.
So we actually did work with Banca Mia in Colombia to target some financial services to the Venezuelans who had received work permits in Colombia and then had an income stream against which Banca Mia could lend. But that's a tiny fragment of the population, right? Because it's a whole process to once be identified, validated, and accepted in your host country and have permission to work. I think there are a couple of other examples, and I'd encourage you to just turn around and talk to Matthew Saul, who's involved in a lot of our credit infrastructure work, which does deal with building credit information systems and having that data transferable. In the case of Ukraine, we made a concerted effort working with our international partners to share data on the creditworthiness of the displaced Ukrainians in Western Europe so that they could go to their host countries, use the data from their home countries and get that automatic validation that they were who they were, and they were able to then transact and integrate much more in their host countries. We have similar kind of examples in Kokuma in Kenya. It's not an easy problem to solve because there's that transitionary nature. There's the ability of the host country to accept this segment of the population and integrate them better into that formal workforce. And only after that does the financial services piece come in. Before that, it's more, remittance-based or payments being facilitated through various UN agencies. And on that, for the identification piece, we've been working with Iris Scan. So I think it's not only a triangle, it's kind of like a multifaceted, lots of pinpoints, but it is a vulnerable community. It is some work needs to be done on various aspects to be able to facilitate financial and digital payments is probably more secure in this kind of environment than hard cash payments.
100%. Kahal, 30 seconds. It's really yours.
Okay, quickly just on procurement. I think it's not coming up in the report specifically because we're not looking at medium enterprises. And I think if we were, it would come up a lot more. And I think it might be a more important lever for formalization and taxation than just digital payments on their own. On formalization more generally, how can it become clearer? I think the answer probably lies on having more practical thresholds around taxation, particularly things like presumptive taxes. If you'd like to hear more about that, we will be discussing it at our conference next month called Public Finance in the Digital Era. Have a look at our website. It's upcoming in Johannesburg. Thank you.
Because the conversation doesn't end here. Thank you so much for such a brilliant discussion. It's possible to summarize, but I think for me, there were two key issues that stood out, and then perhaps 5 specific ones just to try and leave you with something to think about. Trust and collaboration came up over and over and over again, and these are really critical. If you really want to advance these efforts, to include obviously micro and small enterprises, but it goes sort of more generally towards a lot of people. They are unbanked in general, and so that is really at the heart. And that trust will only be built if this collaboration between public and private advances. And I took away 5 sort of critical pieces of that around financial education and payment education, where this world needs to come together. The interoperability, digital ID, simplified KYC, that's where public and private really need to collaborate. The importance of having an open dialogue, Anna Maria said it very clearly. This is a space that's becoming more and more crowded, so we need to make sure that we're also thinking about the evolution and the innovation that we're seeing, and make sure that we're not closing the door to anyone as we try to innovate, to reach out to more people. Leveraging the responsiveness and the timeliness that the private sector offers in this space, and the importance of expanding the evidence base, building the data, because the data are really still scarce and don't allow us to fully understand the needs of macro and small enterprises. And at the heart of all of that has to be the end user. All of this really needs to be done with the end user at the center. This is hopefully the beginning of a conversation that will continue to deepen. We are really delighted to have been involved in this work. And as Kaha was saying, we're currently continuing to work in this space. So delighted to work with all of you. But for today, please join me in thanking Adele, Anna Maria, Chagosia, and Krista for such a great conversation. Of course, Kahal for the research work. Thank you.